and welcome to this session of Tea Time Talks with MDRP. Today, as you know, we're going to be talking about not just generic medical devices, but we are going to be looking at in vitro diagnostic devices. In my opinion, I think the medical devices community has been focusing so much on MDR that we are forgetting that in vitro diagnostic devices are also there. And a new regulation and guideline has come in for these kind of devices too. In order to focus on this extremely critical subject in the devices regulatory space, I have with me today Sue, who's joining us all the way from United Kingdom. Sue, I know that you're an expert in the IVD sector and not just that, even medical devices, but here you're going to be sharing some valuable insights on IVDs and IVDR. So let's have a quick background introduction for our listeners.
Well, thank you for inviting me to talk to you. I'm probably one of the old ladies of the IVD regulatory industry. I've actually been in this industry for about 34 years, working for both small and large multinational manufacturers. But also in this time, I set up LRQA as a notified body back in the day when medical devices and IVD directives first started. And I also set up BSI as an IVD notified body and more latterly worked for UL Underwriters Laboratories as their director for both medical devices and IVDs. So I've kind of been around the block quite a bit. And as part of that, I was involved with representing the notified bodies on the IVD technical group. And this group creates a lot of the guidance documents, for example, the classification document that's just recently been published. So that's kind of I've kind of been poacher and gamekeeper at various points in my career. And so that's the sort of experience that we like to share.
Right. Thank you so much, Sue. And it's very clear that you've got experience right where it matters. You've worked with the notified bodies and you know exactly what these guidelines and requirements are for the devices. And I'm sure that you're able to translate that very well into client requirements. And any companies, device manufacturers that you're working with, they are getting advice right from the expert. And I'm so happy to have you here. Welcome once again.
Thank you.
All right, folks. As always, a quick introduction to what an IVD medical device is. Like I said, it's an in vitro diagnostic device, and generally, different countries, different regulations might define it differently. So, we go towards something that converges the definitions of global regulations, and we look at the International Medical Device Regulators Forum or the IMDRF, which defines an IVD medical device as a device which used alone or in combination as intended by the manufacturer is used for the in vitro examination of specimens derived from the human body, principally to provide information for diagnostic, monitoring, or compatibility purposes. So when you think about IVDs, you can think about going to a diagnostic center and you want to get tested for different things. Like some people want to get tested for diabetes. Then there are people who want to get tested for HIV, tuberculosis, many such things. And there are a lot of reagents that are used. You see people will be withdrawing your blood. They'll be drawing your blood and then they'll be performing tests on that specimen. So the reagents which are used to perform those tests are called IVD products. Now, IVD products have their own regulation, which is the in vitro diagnostic regulation or IVDR, which replaces the IVDD. So, as you are hearing a lot about MDR, MDD, this is similar. So, IVDR is similar to MDR, which is for medical devices, and IVDD was what MDD was to generic medical devices. And IVDR came into existence on 25th May 2017, and the manufacturers are given a 5-year transition period. So we are looking at it from the perspective of 2022, which is when manufacturers should have transitioned completely. And this IVDR, as we'll be discussing more with Sue now, this is a 157-page regulation, and it has a lot more articles, and the number of articles has increased almost 5 times from 24 to 113. Now, without wasting any more time, let's dive right into the questions. Okay, Sue. So to start off, we are talking about IVDs, these devices which belong to general device category also. Like some of these belong to general device category, and because of IVDR, there could have been some sort of classification changes. We're seeing this in generic devices also. So I'm thinking about it from the IVD perspective. Does the impact analysis for this kind of change have to be done on devices in the field as well?
Okay, I think that the first thing to recognise is if we look at the medical device field, over the lifetime of the medical device directive, there were 5 changes. And so if you kind of think about the medical device regulation being the 6th change, there's been every 2 years, there's been a change. And a lot of those have been quite major changes if we think about the changes to clinical evaluation, for example. But then if we look back at the IVD, there was no changes, no significant changes between when it was first issued and what we see today. So effectively, the IVD industry is going from 1 to 6 in one huge move. And part of the knock-on effect of that is that the classification is just not fit for purpose at the moment under the directive. And SARS-CoV-2, the COVID, is definitely a good example of that. So at the moment, those devices under the directive, because they were never envisaged at the time, are self-declared, even though they're obviously very high risk. So the classification system that we have in the directive today is really just not fit for purpose. So it's fairly obvious we need a big change. But the effect that then has on these general IVDs is that in the past, and I think I'm probably the person that originally said 80% of manufacturers currently don't actually need a notified body, don't have oversight, and only 20% do. Now, obviously, over time, various manufacturers have been doing their homework, and in some cases, it's over 90%, in some cases, over 96% of their portfolio will go from being a self-declared product to actually requiring notified body oversight. So this is a huge, massive, great change. That has various different effects. One is the fact that if, again, we compare to the medical device, most manufacturers who will need a notified body under the regulation already have a lot of experience at working with notified bodies, whereas in the IVD industry, they don't. The other big change we've got is that the regulation is very prescriptive. If you start to think about it more in the same way as an FDA regulation, it's very precise. If it says you shall, then they expect to see it. So you can't just justify your way out of it. And all the documentation that you refer to in your technical file has to be provided to the notified body. You can't say, oh, my documentation's in the DHF and just refer out to other reports. You have to summarize it in very prescriptive ways and actually provide those documents. So it's a huge change. And manufacturers really aren't used to working with notified bodies in this way. And then we have the other elephant in the room, which is the number of notified bodies has shrunk drastically. At the moment, we've had 23 notified bodies at the peak under the IVD directive. If everything went swimmingly well, we would have half that number. But at the moment, we're limited to just a small number of notified bodies who've actually been designated. So BSI in the Netherlands and the UK is currently designated, but that will reduce down to 1 once the UK formally leaves the European Union regulatory framework at the end of this year. Then we've got TÜV Süd, TÜV Rhineland, JACRA in Germany. So, we only have a small number of notified bodies who are actually available to actually now deal with considerably more products that actually need a notified body. So there's a little bit of a perfect storm going on here. And I know there's a lot of discussion in the press about, oh, well, will it be delayed in the same way that the medical device was delayed by a year because of COVID? But COVID, again, is a double-edged sword here. And certainly having been on conference panels where there have been both industry and also competent authorities, whilst pragmatically we can see that industry needs as much time as it can to make this huge transition. On the other hand, COVID is this example of why the classification system as it stands doesn't work. So there are pushes in two directions. So I wouldn't bank on there being a blanket extension. It's possible that there could be an extension for certain types of product, but I would not place any money on it. If it comes, we'll all be very grateful. But one of the things I would say is just there is so much to do. If you haven't started now, you really need to get started. That 18 months is going to fly by. And certainly some of those notified bodies are already saying that you need to get your files in if you want to guarantee getting an approval in time for that May 2022 date by summer in 2021, so in 6 months' time. So that really shows you the time pressure.
Oh, wow. I think it's safe to say that there's a lot of homework that manufacturers are going to need to do, because the figures that you quoted, especially, I mean, it seems like you said, manufacturers are not prepared for this kind of a massive change that's coming their way. And a blanket extension, I agree. I don't know whether that's a good thing, firstly. I mean, I'm thinking from a medical devices perspective, also a manufacturer's perspective. It might seem like it's good to have that extra time, but that might not be helpful if the manufacturers don't have clarity on what exactly is required to be done during this time. And like you said, there is not enough room to justify your way out of situations. You need to know exactly what it is that is expected and that is required to be provided by you to the notified bodies. And of course, it's going to be a big change, because if manufacturers so far have been in the process of self declaring their products, suddenly to have these kind of notified body audits and these requirements, it's going to be a huge change. And I wonder how manufacturers are preparing for it, because like I said, all that we continue to hear is the buzz around medical device regulations, but there's not so much talk that is happening on the IVDR front, especially not in the forefront. Because I think maybe people are saying that let's tackle MDR first. It's coming to us first head on. Let's look at it, and then we are going to think about IVDR. But probably that's not the right strategy at this point.
Yeah, I think when the IVD regulation was given a 5-year transition period as opposed to 3 years, which the medical device had. So again, there's probably not going to be so much sympathy if people aren't prepared, because we had an extra 2 years at the beginning. So, and I think it's not until you actually start not just opening and reading the regulation, but actually trying to do it and implement it, that the magnitude of the issue suddenly becomes apparent. Just the sheer level of detail that you are required. And certainly, having helped manufacturers who have started to get their first findings, to be honest, it's what as an ex-notified body person, we expected, but it isn't what industry was necessarily expecting. So if it says a report shall include, and there is a list of bullet points underneath, they're not optional. You have to have each individual bullet point, and they will check each individual bullet point. And if it's not applicable, you need to explain why. And that's the sort of level of detail and prescriptiveness and discipline that we're just not used to in the IVD industry.
Right. Okay. So this is like quite serious because, I mean, of course, everybody in the devices world knows that this is serious, but the gravity of it is more apparent right now when I'm talking to you. And I realize that it's true with the 5 year transition period that was given to IVD manufacturers. I don't believe that they are going to be getting any sort of grace period. And at this point, especially for devices like IVDs, I think it becomes difficult or rather challenging to kind of have all the documentation all of a sudden ready because I have experience in IVD development. I was working with Beckman Coulter, and I know how much of documentation we used to do for a single experiment. Also, we had to maintain DHFs and we had to make sure that our design input, output, verification, validation, everything was in place. And these are IVDs. We are doing constantly running experiments, precision, accuracy, so much of it happening. So I'm thinking about the sheer volume of it. And I hope that manufacturers are taking this seriously and they realize that there is not going to be any blanket extension. I mean, I'm not speaking for the notified bodies, but I'm thinking that, like you said, I don't believe this is something that's going to happen, but we never know how it may turn out. So let's hope for the best.
Yeah, I mean, the notified bodies have actually issued a position paper. They would actually like to see some extension just because of the sheer workload that they've got to get through. But it needs to be done sensibly. So again, I think a lot of the parties recognise that pragmatically, they're probably something's got to give. Otherwise, we're going to have products that are not going to be available on the market. On the other hand, how do you do that sensibly and without people just going, all right, well, I can just put my project on hold for a year and then I'll think about it in another year's time, by which point it's not going to happen. So I think it's one of those, a lot of people work to a deadline, and if you extend the deadline, they'll still not be ready. So it is a very difficult situation, and the best advice is just to certainly you to be honest, people should have started by now, and they should have not only done their gap analysis, but they should have prepared their first files. If you haven't, please, please, please have a go at putting that first file together, because you will not have any idea how difficult it is until you've tried that first one. And then you need to multiply that time by the number of products that you have to actually understand how long it's really going to take you. And get a feeling for, are you going to be able to hit that 26th of May 2022 date or not? It'll get faster after the first one, but the first one will be painful, I assure you.
Right, absolutely. I think that's fantastic advice. I mean, manufacturers, if you've not started already, which you should have, but it's time now to start with your gap analysis, putting together all the files, documents, everything. And fingers crossed, everybody is able to meet the timeline because, like we keep saying, we are not anticipating any extension in the IVDR timeline. Good luck, everyone. All right, moving on. So, Sue, talking about performance and safety evaluation for IVDs, now this is again a question that I hear a lot. We do know a lot about clinical evaluation that is done for generic medical devices. So, when we talk about IVDs, what are the kind of evaluation from a performance and safety standpoint that is expected?
Okay, again, this is perhaps one of those areas which will be a little bit of a shocker to those people who are perhaps in lower risk categories. I'm thinking mainly of the Class B devices, so the thyroid functions, the infertility, those basic assays which are low risk. They're in Class B. But actually, when this data gets reviewed by the notified body, it's going to be reviewed in the same way as it was a Class C or a Class D. It's the frequency that's different. So therefore, there was some discussion when the regulation first came in, and people were saying, oh, well, if you've got a Class B device, you just need to put a STED file together and that's all you need. And that isn't what's expected. So if anybody's attended any of my external webinars or training, you will know that I always talk about intended purpose, and because that's where it all starts to go wrong. And kind of coming back to perhaps one of those things that you were talking about a few minutes ago about, when you're working in the industry and all the work you have to do to put together that, initial verification and validation data. I think with legacy products, one of the things, to a certain extent, it surprised me when I first started to look at some of these files as a consultant, was actually how things have changed. So I'm going to use CA125 as an example. When that was developed, it was a diagnostic tool measuring large amounts of CA125. However, technology has changed. We've now got drugs that can treat ovarian cancer. So actually, sometimes that test is now used for monitoring. And therefore, rather than measuring large amounts of the analyte, we're actually now looking at much lower levels, much closer to the normal range. So the performance you need from your assay is very, very different. However, the original performance evaluation data you put together might be different. Maybe it's supporting the diagnostic, but have you gone back and done the design change for the fact that actually now you've changed your intended purpose? So the bit I always talk about is this intended purpose. And it's, again, a classic example of just how prescriptive the regulation is. So it says that you have to, and there's a list of 9 bullet points that you have to include. You have to say what is detected or measured. You have to specifically state, is it for screening, monitoring, diagnosis, aid to diagnosis, prognosis, prediction? Is it a companion diagnostic? You need to say the specific conditions or risk factors that it's related to, whether it's automated or not, whether it's qualitative, quantitative, semi-quantitative, exactly what specimens you intend it to be used with, exactly what the testing population is, exactly who your intended user is, and if it's a companion diagnostic. So you have to make sure that your intended purpose covers each of those bullet points. And the notified body will go down and look at each of those bullet points. Now, obviously, if you've been using intended use statements, maybe because you've been as part of a 510K, it often doesn't cover those bullet points. However, there's often a summary and explanation piece underneath that might actually include some of that. So in your technical file, you've got to make sure that you have covered your intended purpose and in your instructions for use, that each of these bullet points is covered, and that in the technical file, you specifically point out exactly where each of these is covered. And there's also a claims article, so it can't be confusing in any way or misleading. You have to be very, very precise. So why is that important when it comes to clinical? Well, our clinical is now split into 3 pieces. So we have our scientific validity, and that's where you have to associate the analyte to the clinical condition. And again, I think back in the early days when the first texts were published, people were going like, oh yeah, HCG, pregnancy, it's obvious. We just write a very short paragraph and off we go. But no, that's not what's expected. What's expected is a formal literature search. And the only guidance document we've got to support it, and competent authorities have certainly pointed me in the past to it, is the MedDev 2.7.1 Rev 4. And there's an annex in the back of that that tells you how to do a formal literature search. And practically speaking, what I'm seeing coming out of the notified bodies is that's what they're holding you to. So they're expecting a very formal literature search. You can't just pull out references that you happen to have sitting in your instructions for use or in some user guide and say, oh, that's my literature search done. So it's a very formal process, and is very specifically linked to this very prescriptive intended purpose. And then we move on to the analytical performance. So we're looking at our analytical sensitivity, specificity, etc. To be honest, a lot of what you would be expected to cover as part of your IVD essential requirements. But again, it's going to be hardwired back to what's in your intended purpose. So here, when we were talking about, is it monitoring, diagnosis, aid to diagnosis, etc., what did you say in your intended purpose? And does your analytical performance match to that? So there's, again, a very specific match between the intended purpose and what you put in that analytical performance report, and also what you then claim or the data you provide in your instructions for use as well. So all these bits have to be connected together, and what the notified body will do is check that they are all consistent. And then finally, we have our clinical performance report. So that's going to be more looking at the clinical sensitivity, specificity, our negative and our positive predictive value and things like that, and also our user as well. So data supporting the particular user of a device. So again, that comes back to who did we say our user would be? So not just is it professional or is it a lay user, but if it was a near patient test, who's actually using it? Is it a pharmacist? Is it in an ambulance? Is it in a hospital outreach clinic, a doctor's office? You need to define exactly who it is and what educational background they have, and have data to support the application. So you need to have use data from an actual clinical application, rather than perhaps an internal study you've got on the use of it. It actually has to be by the real user themselves. So that's really quite a difference.
Right. Okay. That's quite a lot that is required from the evaluation standpoint, and rightly so. What you spoke about when you said that use data needs to be provided. So I'm thinking that these kind of usability studies are then going to be supporting our intended users. Basically, that kind of information in the instruction for use. Is that correct?
Well, if you take something also like stability, for example, so stability is one of the parts of the analytical performance report. So in that analytical performance report, you're going to summarize the stability data, but then you're going to be referencing out to the stability study that you did and attaching that to the technical file. So, and then obviously as part of the output of that is whatever stability you've claimed, you're going to be describing as part of your instructions for use. So that's kind of how you've got that, again, sensitivity, specificity. What testing have you done as part of your analytical and clinical performance reports? And then that's what you will expect to see summarized in the instructions for use. So everything's connected. And that's also why it's very difficult to repurpose existing instructions for use. It can be your template to start with, and that then has a huge impact on global registrations, because if you're having to change it for Europe, you then may have to re-register in China, for example.
Right, absolutely. And I think after listening to you, I'm thinking that it's one thing for manufacturers who have devices that have had consistent intended uses. But like you said, if there has been a change in the intended use also, those manufacturers have to not only make sure that their design change, document, gap analysis, everything is in place, but even the previous intended use test, all the documentation related to that, that could also be audited by the notified body, right?
Um, it tends what's in the what you present in the technical file is what will be reviewed. You need to have that data. And again, if you look back at, so I think again in the early days, people seem to think that, oh, this is just a reformatting job. That we had our technical file for the IVD directive, we just reformat it into the IVD regulation. But because the kind of the philosophy is so much different, you may not be going back to the original performance evaluation for a legacy device that you did, because, as you say, what you put in the intended purpose has changed. And it also, you have to consider the relevance of the data that you're putting in there. So maybe my performance evaluation, my original one, was actually done on version 1 of the product, but I actually had to make a series of changes. We've all had the nightmares of having to change because detergent changes, anti-foam changes, and things like that. But actually, therefore, is the data that you had in that original performance evaluation actually still relevant to the product that's on the market today? It may be a different formulation. Therefore, you may actually be presenting data as part of those changes that you've done. And to be honest, sometimes that data is of a better quality for very old assays, because your quality system has evolved and improved over time, and that's actually data you're much more proud to present than perhaps the original data, because some of these assays can be really quite old.
Absolutely, absolutely, yes. And I can relate all this to my days as the R&D scientist, like I said, because I remember that we used to keep all our documentation from the previous formulation, and then we used to obviously during the verification, validation, and design output, all of that design review analysis, we used to keep changing formulations to get the specificity better or the sensitivity higher. And for each of those, we had to have tons of documentation in place. So I can only imagine the volume of work that is required, and especially when you're being audited, the volume of documentation that you need to have available, and how much you need to explain how you went from point A to point B. All of that becomes so important here. So, once again, I think at every question, I'm only hoping that our manufacturers are prepared to deal with this, because this is a huge, huge change that's coming their way.
You
Okay.
also make a good point there as well, in the design folk often are closer to this information, and it's not possible to just take. And this is me saying this as a consultant. It's very difficult to take a consultant and just say, okay, I'm hiring you to write my technical files. Please don't bother any of my staff. Just write them for us, because your product, those changes that have been made. And when we write technical files, we're working very, very interactively with the manufacturer, and not just the regulatory department, but often we're actually very involved with talking to the design folk as well. And when people are looking at the resources they need to do this, sometimes it's all heavily weighted on, oh, well, we need resource in the design, in the QA, RA area. But they're not recognizing the fact that actually we're going to need time from the people who are in the design area and also in the post-market area to pull information and things like that as well. So that's, again, if you're still back in that early planning phase, you need to understand all the things that need to be done and all the people that need to be involved. One of my ex-colleagues likes to talk about it as a cultural change, a cultural shift. And that's because, this isn't something that can be done by some poor regulatory person who's locked in an office on their own and told to write a technical file. They need access to all these other different parts of the organization, which means somebody senior in the company needs to say, hey, this guy's just not annoying you and asking these questions. It's vital to the company keeping their product on the market. And then please provide them with the information that they're asking for if you're going to be successful.
Absolutely. I couldn't have said this any better, because I know that even when I talk to our client partners, and we always insist that we have a cross functional collaboration from their side as well, because it's not enough to just talk to the regulatory folks on their side or the medical writing team. We make sure that we get the R&D also on calls, because we need to understand exactly what happened to the design, what was it, why was the device designed a certain way, what was the design change, and all of that. So, like you said, I think to sum it up, cross functional collaboration is absolutely crucial to understanding what is required from the regulatory perspective itself. All right. Okay, I think this is one question that I avoided asking in the previous round, because I know we were discussing a lot of things. I wanted to ask that time itself. What about human subject trials? When we are talking about IVDs, we spoke about performance and safety evaluation. So, this is an extension of that. What about conducting trials in human subjects? Is that mandatory for IVDs?
Right. Now, the bit that's strange with IVDs compared to medical devices is that we actually start working with human specimens pretty much from day one. So they will definitely expect data from clinical samples. So, I mean, anybody in the industry knows you're not going to get a device approved if you're using just contrived samples. It's just not going to work. So in some respects, we're slightly different from that perspective. But if you're kind of looking at this from the verification versus the validation side, again, this is where, whilst you're using clinical samples, um, a lot of the analytical performance may be activities that you're actually doing internally. Things like reproducibility, yes, it will be part of external validation studies. But certainly once we get into self-test devices, um, it hasn't been as well policed under the IVD directive, but certainly if you look at, for example, MHRA have a guidance document for the directive for self-test devices. Their expectation has always been that there should be a lay user study. And so that is definitely an expectation under the regulation. The same with near patient testing, and the near patient testing needs to be actually on for the clinical application. If you think about, there are some tests that could be used perhaps for testing occupationally versus testing clinically. You couldn't use occupational for clinical, you have to have that clinical data that supports it. So yes, you're expected to have clinical data. How much you can actually do internally and how much can be external will depend on the product, and will also depend on what sources of data you're using. One top tip, read Annex 13 1.2.3. And yes, I actually remember the annex and the bullet point because I say it so frequently. And this says that, for your clinical performance, you can do clinical performance studies, scientific peer-reviewed literature, published experience gained from routine diagnostic testing. Be careful if you say you've done a clinical performance study, they expect that you've met all the requirements for a clinical performance study as described in the regulation in Annex 14. So it does continue on to say that if your clinical performance studies rely on other sources of clinical performance data, like a 510K or a PMA or some other regulatory submission, you need to be clear that that's what it is. So they're not expecting you to go and repeat all your clinical studies. These other sources of data are perfectly applicable. You have to describe why they're relevant to the device that you're doing and be really clear with the language you're using. I keep saying about how prescriptive it is. So if you call something a clinical performance study, they expect it to be a full clinical performance study, meeting all the requirements in the regulation, which of course, if it was done before the regulation existed, it will never meet because there are all sorts of requirements which you didn't even know existed. So just be a little bit careful with that one. But no, it's not expecting you to go out and do additional studies, but it is expecting you to have appropriate clinical studies. And again, so you wouldn't expect just to have in-house analytical performance data, because you're wanting to make sure that there's data on unselected patient samples, for example. Now, another really good source of data is, and everybody uses a different name, the regulation calls them ring trials. In Europe, they're often called EQUAS and NEQUAS studies. The proficiency studies, everybody has a different name for external quality assurance schemes. But sometimes they can also be really useful sources of data because state of the art is really important. And if you're trying to establish that your product is state of the art, it's a really good source of data to use. Having said that, they don't exist in every sector, but if they do, it's a good source of clinical data to use.
Okay, that's perfect. I think, yeah, this is something that manufacturers, a lot of them, of course, this will be something new for them to understand, like the state of the art perspective that you brought over here. So, thank you for that. And just a quick question, you spoke about internal versus external testing. So, I was thinking from a manufacturer's perspective, firstly, I remember that anytime we were performing any testing, which was internally, if we were doing for design verification and for validation, if we decided that we had to go external, we were looking at external samples and doing that. So one thing, traceability becomes very important. We had to always make sure that we had appropriate traceability in place for all the samples that were used for testing. And I think especially when you're working with external teams, external parties, this becomes absolutely important because you need to be able to provide that as a part of your documentation. Second thing, do manufacturers have to provide some sort of justification for why certain tests, if they were done like using different external parties, probably getting samples from one vendor versus another? Do they have to have some sort of justification in place for why, suppose, sensitivity was done with one set of samples and specificity was done from another vendor altogether?
Yeah, so it's not just vendors, because sometimes it may be working with particular external laboratories as well. So kind of two things to consider here. One is that ISO 20916 was published last year. So this tells us how to do a study in the IVD sector, and site selection will be part of that. That actually needs to be considered as part of if you're doing external studies. Don't forget GDPR is the other really important one, and that is specifically mentioned in the regulation. So the samples you're using should have been ethically procured, and it is possible that they will ask you about that as well. Certainly if you're doing any prospective studies, that obviously needs to be clearly covered and documented, but what is your process?
Right. Great point. All right. Okay, so moving on to some specific kinds of devices. For devices such as blood glucose meters, we have these performance standards in the form of ISO 15197. But for other devices like HP screening devices, which do not have such performance standards, in such cases, how do we evaluate these devices?
Okay, so yeah, I mean, we're lacking considerably having particular product-based standards in the IVD sector. However, we've got other useful guideline stroke standards which are really useful to consider. So CLSI documents, for example, they're not specifically mentioned in the regulation. However, most notified bodies would recognize them. Now, the only thing is, if you're using a CLSI document and you've got a legacy product, just be aware of the fact that these documents change. Let's take interfering substances as an example. So interfering substances, biotin, we never thought biotin would be an issue way back in the day, and obviously people are consuming large amounts of biotin now as part of healthy living, and people go to the gym. So though that sort of consideration has changed, so if you were using the interfering substances CLSI document 20 years ago with your legacy product, you're now on a different revision of that document today, you would need to do a gap assessment and identify. Now, if you were doing streptavidin conjugates, then it may be that actually you've done it. You should have done a study to actually look at that, because it's now a common interfering substance. So you would at that point pull in, you take the original data and you'd also add in the data from your additional post-market study that you'd done, and you'd consider both of those. But if you're using any standards, any guidelines, you always need to make sure you're keeping a watch on, as part of your post-market surveillance activities, on what is the latest version, and do a gap analysis and determine whether it's relevant. Sometimes, if they've added a new interfering substance for saliva and you're not, you're doing a blood test, then you can easily justify why it's not relevant. The other thing is that also in some sectors, there are also sectorial guidelines that might actually be really useful, because part of what they're doing here is they're helping you establish what the state of the art is. And so that might get sucked into your scientific validity report. That's where you might be identifying these as potential sources. Again, you need to keep a watch on as they change. But if it's not a harmonized standard, you need to justify why it's good practice. So if it is a peer-reviewed, for example, or you need to describe why you're relying on it, why you think it is such good practice, why does it enshrine maybe either best practice or state of the art, for example, and describe that in your technical file. So yeah, we don't have those standards, but this is kind of how we fill the gap in the middle.
Okay. Okay. So I think as long as manufacturers are able to justify how they are performing any sort of evaluation without any reference standard, it should be fine. And this justification, of course, also requires, like we keep saying, cross functional collaboration, because your design team is going to be looking at it from one perspective, and then the regulatory and quality teams are going to be bringing in their perspective as to whether that justification fits or not, right?
Yeah, and even if you didn't actually do studies to the CLSI, I'm taking, interfering substances again as an example. Maybe you didn't do that, use that as an input when you actually did your original studies. Just be aware that the notified bodies may well also be considering that in best practice. You're not going to get a non-conformance to the CLSI, but you may get a non-conformance because they don't think you've significantly covered interfering substances, because they know that there is this internationally recognized list of interfering substances and you've missed one out. So it may not be that people are applying standards as best practice. But if there is something like that that applies in your sector, it's good to be aware of it, even if you haven't fully met it.
Right, absolutely. Okay, great. I think this brings us to the last question of the session. So, talking about point of care testing, do we always have to compare it with the lab analyzer? Now, this is again going even more specific, a question that I'm asking you. So, what do you think about this?
Well, one of the things you have to determine is, what is best practice, what is state of the art, what is truth. So whether it be a point of care test, or whether it be an analyte where there isn't an international reference preparation, you have to describe in your technical file what you consider to be truth. So if you took a blood glucose meter, do you compare a blood glucose meter to another blood glucose meter, or do you compare it to a Yellow Springs or some other um, uh, sort of recognized gold standard? So there's probably not a hard and a fast rule on this, but normally, yes, it would be. It's more likely that the analyzer is going to be considered to be the gold standard. Obviously, technology could change with time, and it may be that you actually end up with a state-of-the-art gold standard, which is a point of care device. But by and large, you're usually going back to the analyzer. But you have to describe. It's part of the state of the art is proving that your product isn't best in class, but it is appropriate to meet your intended purpose. And so as part of that, you're having to describe, you may be looking at, for example, how you compare to perhaps another point of care device. But the lab analyzer still remains the gold standard. So you may be looking at how you perform compared to other devices, but it's more of a marketing tool. And actually, for the precise analytical performance as part of your analytical performance report, you may still be comparing back to the truth being the analyzer. Now, on the other hand, if you were looking at maybe usability or something like that, then it may be that actually you are comparing yourself to be as good or better than another point of care device. So that's why I say it's not necessarily a hard and fast rule. Look at it as, how do I establish truth for my device? How do I establish state of the art? And state of the art's an odd one. It talks about state of the art in medicine. I think, having had discussions both with industry and regulators, we've kind of come to the conclusion it means the same thing. But again, it's that establishing of what is actually needed for this test to do to perform its function, and what do you consider to be truth? And then you need to be able to justify it. So if you're comparing yourself to another point of care device, you've really got to be certain that that is state of the art, best in class, and it is truth.
All right. So I think for each kind of device, I don't want to say for each device, but each kind of device, the manufacturers have to do some groundwork in terms of how they want to go about showing the evaluation. Like you said, whether they want to compare it to a gold standard, whether they want to compare it to just another device which is performing the same kind of functionality. And on the basis of that, like you said, for it's not a hard and fast rule to have to compare it with the lab analyzer, which is a gold standard. You have to decide how you want to go ahead with the demonstration of the evaluation, overall evaluation for your device.
And don't forget that the technical file, you do have to identify what you consider to be similar devices. And often there isn't necessarily a similar device. Maybe you're the first to do a point of care or a self-test. So you're having to look at something that uses a different technology. And certainly with things like COVID, we see a lot of potential new technologies as well. So again, you're looking at what is truth, and having to describe that.
Right, absolutely. I think especially now you've been using the example of COVID because that is especially relevant to the discussion that we are having on IVDs. And like you said, there are so many new technologies coming in. So yeah, manufacturers have to have that kind of thinking, and I don't think there is some sort of there's no standard rule here that they have to follow this. This is very straightforward. So everyone has to think about how they want to go ahead with the demonstration of conformity and evaluation for the devices.
I'll quote one of my colleagues, Leonard Buchner, and he always says the most important thing is good science. And that's why, you've got to go back to basics. And I think if you go back to basics with a lot of this and look at it as doing good science, then you won't go far wrong.
Absolutely. I am a proponent for this. I always say we have to go back to the basics, and that's where you'll get most of your answers. So great. All right. Here we are at the end of this talk, and I can't believe that this was already done. Sue, I had so much fun listening to all the insights that you had about IVD and IVDR. Any final thoughts before we conclude the session?
I think it would just be that plea to industry. If you haven't started, please, please, please start now. As I say, I'm the old lady of the regulation. I worked for a notified body at the end of the transition periods for medical devices in the early days, and the stress that manufacturers were under when they suddenly realized that their products would not be on the market was incredible. So I wouldn't like you to be in that situation. So and then the other is to think about how are you going to accelerate yourself to actually get through this process. If you haven't got a notified body, pick up the phone literally today to them and start talking to one. If you're not even on their radar, they will deal with their customers first, because and they will then take on new customers as they have resource. Certainly, as I say, I've worked for 3 different notified bodies over the last 20 years. And certainly in the early days, they would never even discuss resource with you. When I was at UL, you had to give extremely detailed plans for the resourcing that you had, and that you couldn't take on new customers in a particular area if you didn't have the resource to cover it. So if you're late in that queue and that queue is full, they won't be able to take you on. So you don't want to be in that situation. Fortunately, more notified bodies are now coming on stream, so that's good. Watch the NANDO website to see if a new one's coming on. And if you're with a notified body today and they haven't been designated yet, just check that your products will be in the scope that they've applied for, and just find out how what their expected due date is for designation, so that you can make sure that you've got your files ready, to start as soon as they're able to do it. But again, don't expect that it's going to be you send it in and you're going to get your certificate the next day. This is quite a long process. So there's usually 3 rounds of questions. And if you don't answer all the questions at the end of those 3 rounds, you will get a refusal. So this is time limited, but it isn't necessarily a quick process either. It could easily take you 3 to 6 months to get through that process, which is why some of the notified bodies are saying you need to have your submission in by summer. So the last thing is just good luck.
Wow, yes. I think, like I keep saying, this is going to be one joyride for manufacturers. And I echo your sentiments, device manufacturers, IVD manufacturers. If you've not started, this is the time to start. And like Sue said, pick up the phone, get in the queue of notified bodies, because that's another aspect which you have very rightly highlighted. It's not just about getting your documentation together, it's also about making sure that you're in the queue, because there is not enough resource right now to take care of all the IVD manufacturers. So you need to make sure you get this done in a timely manner. And this was, as always, excellent advice too. And personally, for me, this session was very, very illuminating, because I too have been on the development side of IVDs, but not so much on the consultant side. And I think that this is such an important topic for us to focus on. And I hope that more and more people are becoming aware of what is required in the implementation and the transition into IVDR. And this was some excellent discussion that we had. I also look forward to having you again, because I think that there is a wealth of knowledge that you can provide. And I'll be very happy if we can schedule some future sessions where we can look at some different topics and we can use your expertise to understand this area more.
Thank you very much for that invitation. As most of my colleagues, past and present, know, I love this stuff, so I'm always happy to talk about IVDs.
Yes, I can see there is this passion in your voice when you're explaining, also, and which makes the discussion even more interesting, because you genuinely like what you're discussing. That's why I said that I'm definitely going to make it a point to bring you back on these talks, and we're going to have another round of discussion, and we'll see what we want to talk about then. But for now, this was excellent. Once again, thank you for being here.
Thank you very much.
Great. That's all that we have for today, folks. I hope you enjoyed the discussion on IVDR, and I'm going to see you in the next session of Tea Time Talks with MDRP. Bye bye.